You think women are attracted to confidence. But most men completely misunderstand what confidence actually looks like, especially as they get older. They think it's about talking more, being more interesting, trying harder to impress. So they fill the silence. They explain themselves. They try to prove they're worth attention. And without realizing it, they slowly lose it. Because the more a man tries to be seen, the less he actually stands out. You've probably felt this before. You say the right things, but something feels off. You try to be engaging, but the energy doesn't land. And deep down, you start wondering, what are you missing? Here's the truth most men don't want to hear. Attraction is not built on effort. It's built on control. Control over your reactions. Control over your words. And most importantly, control over your need to be validated. And this is why older men, the ones who truly understand this, suddenly become magnetic without trying. They don't chase attention. They don't force connection. They don't need to prove anything. And that's exactly why people start paying attention to them. In this video, you'll discover 3 masculine habits. Simple, quiet, almost invisible habits that completely change how you're perceived. Not by trying harder, but by doing less with intention. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Because everything starts to shift from here. Most men don't fail because they lack value. They fail because they reveal their need too early. And too clearly. And once that need is visible, attraction starts to disappear. Not slowly, but almost instantly. Look at how most men behave when they meet someone they're interested in. They lean forward just a little too much. They respond just a little too fast. They try to keep the interaction alive, even when it's already fading. Not because they're confident, but because they're afraid. Afraid of losing attention. Afraid of silence. Afraid that if they stop trying, everything will collapse. So they overcompensate. They talk more than necessary. They explain things that don't need explanation. They try to make sure they're liked, instead of letting it happen naturally. And in doing so, they slowly give away their position. Because the moment you start trying to be chosen, you stop being the one who chooses. And that shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Attraction doesn't grow from effort. It grows from tension, from space, from what is held back, not what is given away too quickly. But most men can't sit in that space. Silence makes them uncomfortable. Distance makes them anxious. Uncertainty feels like rejection. So they rush to fix it. They send another message. They try to clarify what they meant. They try to keep things smooth, predictable, safe. But attraction is not built in safety. It's built in emotional contrast. And when everything is explained, everything becomes flat, predictable, forgettable. And here's where it gets deeper. Women are not evaluating you the way you think. They're not analyzing your words line by line. They are reading your emotional state, your timing, your tone, your ability to stay grounded or not. Every reaction you have is a signal. If you respond instantly, it signals urgency. If you over-explain, it signals insecurity. If you need reassurance, it signals dependency. And none of these signals create attraction. They create pressure. And pressure closes people off. This is why younger men struggle so much, even if they have everything else going for them. They are too available, too reactive, too eager to maintain connection. They don't let things breathe. They don't allow curiosity to build. They reveal everything too early. Now compare that to a man who has learned control. He doesn't rush to respond. He doesn't try to fill every silence. He doesn't chase every opportunity. He allows space to exist without feeling the need to fix it. And that alone changes how he is perceived. Because now, instead of him moving toward people, people start moving toward him. Not because he's doing more, but because he's doing less without losing his center. And that difference is what most men never understand. Because they're too focused on what to say, instead of what to stop doing. Because real attraction doesn't come from adding more behavior. It comes from removing the behaviors that reveal you're not in control. So the real question is not, how do I become more attractive? It's this: what am I doing right now that exposes my need? And once you start seeing that clearly, you begin to realize something uncomfortable. You were never lacking value. You were just giving it away too easily. And until you learn to hold it, nothing else will change. Most men think attraction is something external. Something you earn. Something you build. Something you convince someone to feel. But from a Stoic perspective, that's already the mistake. Because the moment your focus moves outward, you lose control. And once you lose control, everything becomes unstable. The Stoics understood something most men today ignore. You don't control how others see you. You don't control how they respond. You don't control whether they stay or leave. And the more you try to control those things, the more anxious you become. The more reactive you become. And that reaction is what people feel. Not your words. Not your intentions. Your lack of control. This is why Stoicism doesn't start with behavior. It starts with awareness. A clear separation between what is yours and what is not. Your thoughts are yours. Your reactions are yours. Your presence is yours. But their opinion? Not yours. Their attraction? Not yours. Their decision? Never yours. And when a man truly understands this, something shifts. He stops performing. He stops adjusting himself constantly. He stops trying to read every signal and respond perfectly. Because he no longer needs to control the outcome. And this is where real stability begins. Because now, his state is no longer dependent on what happens outside of him. If someone is interested, he remains the same. If someone pulls away, he remains the same. No spike. No drop. Just steady. And that steadiness is what most people rarely experience. It's unfamiliar. It's hard to read. And because of that, it becomes attractive. Not because he's trying to be attractive, but because he is no longer disturbed. This is the core of Stoic masculinity. Not dominance. Not aggression. But control. Control over impulse. Control over emotion. Control over the urge to react immediately. Because reaction is easy. Anyone can react. Anyone can defend themselves. Explain themselves. Prove themselves. But restraint? Restraint requires awareness. Restraint requires discipline. And most importantly, restraint requires confidence without needing validation. This is why silence becomes powerful. Not because silence is a trick, but because silence shows that you are not controlled by the moment. You don't rush to fill space. You don't rush to be understood. You allow things to unfold without interference. And in that space, your presence becomes heavier, more grounded, more real. And here's where most men lose before they even begin. They try to apply techniques without changing their internal state. They try to act calm. They try to appear confident. But underneath, they are still seeking approval, still reacting internally, still attached to outcomes. And people can feel that. Because authenticity is not what you show. It's what you don't need to hide. So if there is still tension inside you, it will leak out. Through your voice. Through your timing. Through your reactions. And no technique can cover that. This is why Stoicism is not about doing more. It's about removing everything that makes you unstable. The need to impress. The need to be liked. The need to be validated. Because once those are gone, what remains is something very few men have. A calm, grounded presence that does not move easily. And that presence alone changes how people respond to you. Without effort, without force, without trying. But understanding this is only the beginning. Because knowing the principle is very different from living it. And this is where most men fall apart again. Because in real situations, control is tested, not in theory, but in moments where you feel pressure, moments where you want to react, moments where your ego wants to step in. And if you fail there, everything resets. So the question is not, do you understand this? It's this: can you stay in control when it actually matters? Because that's where the difference is made. The first habit is simple to understand, but extremely difficult to master. Control your reactions, not your words, not your image, your reactions. Because in most situations, your first reaction is not who you are. It's your conditioning. It's your insecurity. It's your ego trying to protect itself. And if you act on it immediately, you give away control. Let's look at how this plays out in real life. You send a message, and they don't reply. Your mind starts moving. Did I say something wrong? Are they losing interest? Should I send something else? And before you even realize it, you feel the urge to fix it, to send another message, to reopen the conversation, to regain control. But that urge is the exact moment that defines you. Because if you react there, you're no longer in control. You're being controlled. Controlled by uncertainty. Controlled by fear of losing attention. Now look at the alternative. Same situation. No reply. But instead of reacting, you pause. You observe the urge. Without acting on it, you let the moment exist. Without interference. And something subtle happens. The emotional charge begins to fade. The need to act weakens. And you regain control, not over them, but over yourself. This is what most men never train. They train what to say. They rehearse lines. They think about strategies. But they never train the space between stimulus and response. And that space is where power exists. Because if you can control that moment, you can control everything that follows. Let's take another example. You're in a conversation. They say something slightly dismissive, maybe even a small test. Most men react instantly. They defend themselves. They try to prove a point. They explain why they're right. And in doing so, they lower their position, because they're now seeking validation. But a man who has control does something different. He doesn't react immediately. He listens. He lets the comment sit, without rushing to respond. And when he does speak, it's calm, measured, unbothered. Not because he's pretending, but because he didn't let the moment control him. And that difference is felt instantly. Because calmness under pressure is rare. Anyone can be calm when things are easy. But when there is tension, that's when your real state is revealed. And this is why reaction control is so powerful. Because it changes how every interaction feels. You become slower, but more intentional. You speak less, but with more weight. You stop chasing control outside, and start building it inside. And people notice that, not consciously, but instinctively. They feel that you are not easily moved. That you are not trying to impress. That you are not reacting to every shift in the interaction. And that creates something most men never have. Emotional stability. And emotional stability creates safety. And safety creates attraction. But here's the part most men get wrong. They think control means suppression. They try to shut down their emotions. They try to act cold, detached. But that's not control. That's avoidance. Real control is awareness without reaction. You feel everything, but you don't act on everything. You notice the impulse, but you don't obey it. And that's what creates freedom. Because now, you are not a prisoner of the moment. You are not pulled by every emotion, not pushed by every thought. You decide when to move. And when a man reaches that point, his presence changes. He doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to dominate the space. Because control is already visible. And once that becomes consistent, everything else starts to shift. But control alone is not enough. Because even if you control your reactions, you can still destroy everything with what you say next. The second habit is where most men lose everything they built. Because even if you control your reactions, you can still destroy your presence with your words. Speak less, but mean more. Not less because you have nothing to say. Less because you don't need to say everything. Most men talk to fill space. They talk to avoid silence. They talk to keep attention. They talk to make sure the interaction doesn't die. But in doing so, they dilute their own presence. Because when words are constant, they lose weight. And when everything is explained, nothing feels important. Think about it. The more someone talks, the less you remember. The more someone explains, the less you feel. But when someone speaks slowly, pauses, chooses their words carefully, you listen. Not because they demand attention, but because they don't waste it. This is what older men understand. They don't rush to respond. They don't feel the need to fill every gap in conversation. They allow silence to exist without trying to control it. And that silence creates tension. Not awkward tension. Presence. Because now, every word they say carries intention. Let's look at how this changes everything. You're in a conversation. Instead of speaking immediately, you pause. Just for a second. You think. You choose your words, instead of reacting with the first thing that comes to mind. And when you speak, you keep it simple, clear, direct. No extra explanation. No unnecessary detail. And suddenly, the dynamic shifts. Because now, people have to lean in to understand you. Instead of you leaning forward, trying to be understood. That shift alone changes your position completely. Now let's go deeper. Most men over-explain because they want to be accepted. They think clarity creates connection. But too much clarity kills curiosity. If everything is obvious, there's nothing to explore, nothing to feel, nothing to wonder about. And attraction needs space to grow. It needs unanswered questions. It needs a sense that there's more beneath the surface. But when you explain everything, you remove that depth. You flatten yourself. This is why mystery is powerful. Not fake mystery. Not playing games. But simply, not revealing everything at once. Letting people discover you, instead of presenting everything up front. And that requires restraint. Because the urge to explain is strong. The urge to be understood is natural. But when you can resist that urge, your words gain weight. And when your words have weight, your presence becomes stronger. Now here's something most men misunderstand. Speaking less does not mean being silent all the time. It means being intentional. It means knowing when to speak and when to stop. Because stopping at the right moment is just as important as speaking. Ending a sentence without over-explaining. Leaving a thought unfinished. Just enough for the other person to think about it. And this is where communication becomes powerful. Not in what you add, but in what you leave out. And people feel that. They feel that you're not trying to convince them. Not trying to impress them. Not trying to control how you're perceived. And that lack of effort creates a different kind of attention. The kind that is voluntary. The kind that moves toward you, instead of being pulled. But even this is not enough. Because you can control your reactions, you can control your words, and still lose everything. Because of one thing most men never let go of. The need for a specific outcome. The third habit is the one that changes everything. Detachment. Not from people, not from connection, but from outcome. Because most men don't just want interaction. They want a specific result. They want interest. They want validation. They want things to go a certain way. And the moment you want a specific outcome, you lose your freedom. Because now, your behavior is no longer natural. It becomes strategic. You start thinking about what to say. Instead of just saying it, you start adjusting your actions based on how you think it will be received. And slowly, you stop being yourself. Not intentionally, but because you're trying to control something that was never in your control. This is where pressure is created. Not by what you do, but by what you want. Because people can feel expectation. They can feel when you need something from them. And that need changes the entire interaction. It makes things heavier, less natural, less free. And attraction cannot grow in that environment. It needs space. It needs ease. It needs the absence of pressure. And that only happens when you are detached from the result. When you are okay, no matter what happens. If they respond, fine. If they don't, fine. If things move forward, fine. If they don't, still fine. And this is not indifference. It's stability. Because your state is no longer dependent on their decision. You are no longer waiting for something outside of you to define how you feel. And that changes everything. Because now, you move differently. You speak without hesitation. You pause without anxiety. You walk away without fear. Not because you don't care, but because you are not attached. And that creates something rare. Freedom inside the interaction. And freedom is felt instantly. People feel that you are not trying to control them. Not trying to hold on to them. Not trying to make something happen. And because of that, they relax. They open. They lean in without being pulled. This is why detachment is so powerful. Because it removes pressure. And when pressure is gone, connection becomes natural again. But most men struggle with this. Because they think detachment means losing interest. They think if they don't care, they'll lose the opportunity. But the opposite is true. The more you need the outcome, the faster you lose it. And the moment you let go of that need, you become dangerous in a different way. Because now, you are not chasing. You are not holding. You are simply present. And presence is what people are actually drawn to. Now step back and look at the full picture. Not as separate habits, but as one complete way of being. A man who controls his reactions doesn't get pulled by every situation. A man who speaks less doesn't leak his energy through unnecessary words. And a man who is detached from outcomes doesn't depend on anything outside of himself. Put these together, and something changes. Not just in how he acts, but in how he feels. In every interaction, he becomes slower. Not weak, but deliberate. There is no rush in him. No urgency to prove something. No need to be understood immediately. He listens more than he speaks. And when he speaks, there is weight behind it. Because his words are not driven by emotion. They are chosen, measured, grounded. And that alone changes how people respond to him. Now look at how he moves through situations. He doesn't react when tested. He doesn't chase when things go quiet. He doesn't force connection when it's not there. He allows things to unfold naturally, without interference. And because of that, he creates space. Space for curiosity. Space for tension. Space for people to come toward him instead of him reaching out. And this is where everything shifts. Because most men are constantly moving outward, trying to get attention, trying to maintain interest, trying to control the interaction. But this man moves inward first. He controls himself. And that internal control becomes visible externally. Not through effort, but through presence. You can feel it when someone like this walks into a room. They don't demand attention. They don't try to dominate. But somehow, they stand out. Because they are not reacting to the environment. They are stable within it. And stability is rare. Especially in a world where everyone is constantly reacting. Constantly seeking validation. Constantly trying to be seen. So when someone isn't doing that, It creates contrast. And contrast creates attention. But more importantly, it creates trust. Because people feel that this man is not trying to take something from them. Not trying to control them. Not trying to impress them. He is simply there. Grounded. Present. Unmoved. And that presence is what most men are missing. Not techniques. Not lines. But control. At a deeper level. And once that becomes natural, everything else becomes effortless. The way you speak. The way you respond. The way people feel around you. It all starts to align without forcing it. But there's one final shift that most men never fully make. Because even when they understand all of this, they still try to use it to get something. And that is where everything breaks again. At the end of the day, this was never about becoming more attractive. That was just the surface. What this is really about is becoming stable. Because attraction is unpredictable. It comes and goes. It shifts. It depends on things you will never fully control. But stability? That's yours. That's something you build and carry with you into every situation. And once you have that, everything else becomes secondary. You stop chasing reactions. You stop measuring your value based on how people respond. Because your state no longer changes with their behavior. And that's where real power begins. Not in controlling others, but in not being controlled by them. Because when you think about it, most men are not rejected. They are just reacting too much. Too quickly. Too emotionally. Too obviously. And in doing so, they reveal something they don't even realize. That their internal state is unstable. But the moment that changes, everything changes with it. You become harder to read. Not because you're hiding anything, but because you're no longer leaking everything. You become calmer. Not because nothing affects you, but because you don't respond to everything you feel. And you become more attractive? Not because you tried to be, but because you removed everything that made you look like you were trying. And that's the shift most men never make. They keep adding more techniques, more words, more effort, when the real move is subtraction. Remove the need to impress. Remove the need to explain. Remove the need for a specific outcome. And what's left is something simple, but powerful. A man who is in control of himself. And that's rare. So rare that when people feel it, they don't question it. They respond to it without knowing why. And that's when everything becomes effortless. Not because life is easier, but because you are no longer fighting yourself in every moment. So if there's one thing to take from this, it's not what to do. It's what to stop doing. Because the less you force, the more things begin to align. Naturally. Quietly. Without effort. And in that space, you become something most men never reach. Not louder. Not more visible. But undeniable. Because when you stop trying to be seen, you become impossible to ignore.